Hello, I'm Luis Parra.
And I'm Angel Renteria.
Our videographer is Luis Martha, and today we're interviewing Mr.
John McNally.
On May 12, 2023 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, to start off, what is your earliest memory as a child?
I think I have a very good memory, and I think it was in 1947. I was about 2.5 years old. I was born in July of 1945. We had the largest snowstorm in Milwaukee's history, and the snow was piled up to the level of the first floor windows on everybody's house. It was not only a deep snow, but it drifted. It was very cold weather, and people my age or older still talk about the snowstorm. So I think the first realization I had of my surroundings was that snowstorm. Vehicles were marooned in the streets for weeks. People usually went back and forth either to work on sleds or toboggans, and kids did not go to school during that period of time, and most of the stores were closed, such as the grocery stores, because they couldn't get any supplies. So that's my first recollection.
Were you trapped inside of the house, or did you play with the neighborhood kids?
We were pretty much trapped inside of the house. I remember that we went to eat dinner at the neighbor's house one evening, and I wish I still had it, but we had a 16mm film that the neighbor took of the snowstorm and the piles of snow all over the place. It took a long time for Milwaukee to get moving again after the storm.
So about the neighborhood, were you close with your neighbors?
Very much so. I think it might have been the tune of the times, but I grew up in a neighborhood in Wauwatosa that's adjacent to North 68th Street and West Wisconsin Avenue. So it's kind of on the southernmost boundary of Wauwatosa and the southern boundary of Milwaukee.
And as a child throughout the neighborhood, what was the main activities you did with the neighborhood kids?
Almost everyone played softball. That was the neighborhood deal. We had a playground about 3 blocks away. We went every day during the nicer weather and played softball on the playground. And when we were at home in the neighborhood, we had a little softball diamond that we mapped out in the street, and we put cardboard bases, and everybody in the neighborhood played softball. That was the game of the times.
Did you guys ever get in trouble with the adults just for being kids?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember we got caught after a long period of time of success. The kids in those days snitched cigarettes all the time. We would either take them out of our parents' our mother's purses, our father's suit coat jackets, or whatever, and we had a place behind a garage in my neighborhood that was rather secluded, and the kids all smoked. So that was primarily the problem that the parents had with us. But I think kids were pretty respectful at that time. I don't know if we were kind of afraid of our parents or whatever, but when the parent said something, you usually did it.
Do you have any memorable scars or something on your body from just playing outside that you
Oh, sure. I have a scar in the middle of my forehead from a school door at St. Jude's School closing right in the middle of my forehead. And if you know anything about a scalp wound, they bleed like crazy. So I bled for most of the school day. I also have a scar on the left side of my face where a soda bottle blew up in my face. And that was a problem for a long period of time. But those are the only battle scars I really have.
Do you remember, for what reason or like where you were or what you were doing when the soda bottle blew up?
Yes, I was delivering soda for Groff Beverages, and the person helping me on the truck was frustrated because he couldn't get the boxes in line. So he took a box and he threw it, they're called boxes or cases. He threw it on the floor of the truck, and I was standing outside, and the top bottle blew up and the jagged glass hit me in the face.
You mentioned in the pre-interview that your dad, the person who sold your dad his your house, like worked on the Manhattan Project. Was he
Yes.
a distinct personality? Was he like, did he act in any type of way?
I don't know, because I was just being born when my dad bought the house. My dad bought the house in July of 1945 from a guy named John Rattaliata, who was a member of the Manhattan Project. And after my mother left the hospital and they moved out of their house on 60th Street in Milwaukee, we moved in on October 1st, 1945. But between the time I was born and the time we moved in, all the guys on the Manhattan Project had surreptitiously left their residence and so on. And the United States government had dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki shortly after I was born on August 6th and August 9th, 1945.
So your parents are Milwaukee natives too, right?
No, my mother was born in a small town in central Wisconsin called Chilton. Chilton is about 30 miles south of Green Bay, and my father was born and raised in Superior, Wisconsin, which is adjacent to Duluth, Minnesota.
Do you know how your parents met?
Yes. My mother was a teacher in Menasha, Wisconsin after she graduated from college. And her roommate was dating a fellow.
John Moyler, call the security desk, please.
Was
Mr. John Moyler, call the security desk, please.
My mother was teaching in Menasha, and her roommate, a person named Helen Corey, had a boyfriend in Milwaukee named Walter McNally. And she was coming to Milwaukee to spend the weekend, and she said to my mother, "Why don't you come along? Walter's older brother is going to be there." So my mother came to Milwaukee, and that's where it started, just for a visit.
And when you moved into your new neighborhood, or when you were born, what was the demographic of the neighborhood? Was it mostly white?
It was completely white. I think that the only person who came to the neighborhood who was of any other culture other than Anglo-Saxon was my aunt, whose name was Carmen Zelda Wando. She was married to my uncle Leo Fox, and she was Hispanic, and she was kind of an oddity in the 1940s to be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at least that area of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But as far as African American kids were we had some interaction because there was a large orphanage near our house. It was called the Milwaukee Children's Home, or the Home for Dependent Children. And after the Second World War, it was a very large orphanage. And we used to play athletics with the kids from that school. And many of them were African American. So that was my first association with any African American kids. And additionally, there was another orphanage in my neighborhood, and there were African American kids there. And we played athletics together in the summer frequently. And we loved going there because they had a swimming pool.
As an elementary student, what was the dynamic at St. Jude's?
At St. Jude's in the 1950s, I do not think there were any ethnic kids from ethnic groups other than middle-class white America. We did not have any African American students, and I don't recall any Hispanic students or Asian students.
Were there any people that you remember at St. Jude's?
Oh, I remember all kinds of them. Twice a year, 9 of us from Marquette High School get together because one of our classmates, Dennis McNally, who's a Jesuit priest at Georgetown, comes to town, and I usually have a luncheon for the 9 of us because McNamara is in town and would like to see the guys. And 4 of those people and I went to grade school together, including McNamara. So after all these years, I still have contact with kids from my grade school. It's kind of an odd situation, but I do.
Is there any teachers from St. Jude's that you remember specifically for what they did or do?
I do. Unfortunately, they have, I think uniformly have died. But I had a 7th grade teacher by the name of Richard Lenadelli. And in those days, almost every grade was taught by a nun. So he was an unusual figure in a Catholic grade school. And with my recollection, he was, without question, the best teacher from, certainly from kindergarten to the time I came to Marquette High School that I ever had. He was light years ahead of himself. He was just great. And then I had a teacher here at Marquette High School who I thought the same of, and one at college and one at Marquette Law School. So I've had one in each school that I've attended, but Richard Lenadelli was the one in grade school.
Was there anything in specific that he's done to make him so memorial?
He was, you could always count on Mr. Lenadelli. He was there on time, he was always prepared, he demanded a lot of the students, and he was very nice to everybody. I think he led with example. Not all the teachers in grade school did that. You know, they ruled with an iron hand, if you will. But Richard Lenadelli was just great. He was remarkable.
What type of student were you?
I was kind of a middle-of-the-road student, I would say. I became a pretty good student at the end of the run when I went to law school. But other than that, I usually felt that I could find more interesting things to do in the evening other than my homework.
What did you usually do to get out of doing homework?
Oh, we'd make up lies that we were going to another friend's home to study as a group. And of course we didn't. We would go to some girl's home and spend time in their basement rec room. You know, I don't know if our parents ever believed us, but it worked for a good number of years.
And what types of entertainment was there like around the city, around your block? Like, were there like any like buildings with like that offered like certain entertainments like that were popular amongst kids?
Well, the only thing that was really amusing is something that still remains today, and that's Gillis's Frozen Custard Stand on 75th and Blue Mountain. That's pretty much where we congregated all the time.
And speaking of like entertainment and industries, we learned that during World War II that like a bunch of industries arose. How were the industries affected after World War II? Like Alice Chalmers or like Briggs and Stratton. How were those companies?
Oh, those companies were going great guns, and they went because the people were coming back from the war and there was a supply of workers. But about 10 blocks from our house was a company that isn't there any longer. It was called Alice Chalmers. And I believe that Alice Chalmers and General Motors were the largest war vehicle and manufacturing plants in the country. So I think Alice Chalmers employed 14,000 people, which was quite a deal. But Milwaukee was doing well after the Second World War.
You have a couple images or papers that you brought in.
I did. I brought a couple of things. I just opened a box in the basement. This is a picture of my brother and myself. I'm the cute little fellow on the left. My brother and I are 3 years apart. I graduated here in 1963, and he graduated in 1960. I was probably about 18 months old when this picture was taken. This is a picture of my mother, who actually raised my brother and myself because my father died in 1952, the summer after I was in the first grade. This is the house that we grew up on. It's a sketch on Grand Parkway, which is an angle street off of 68th and Wisconsin Avenue. We lived there from the time I was born till I got married when I was 29, and my mother lived there 50 years. Here's a picture of my high school graduation picture. I was much thinner and I had much more hair at the time. And here are relatives who helped raise me. My aunt and uncle Leo and Carmen Fox, my mother in the middle, and my aunt and uncle Paul and Marty Fox. They were very important to me and very helpful to me when I grew up. So that's what I brought.
So speaking of your father, did the dynamic, or like how did your daily routine change, or if it did change?
Oh yes, it changed. It was pretty peculiar. I was the only person in my class for many, many years who came from a single parent household. I was also one of two children whose mother worked. In the 50s, women were stay-at-home mothers, and my mother, of course, had to work to support us. And I think that I was the only person from a single-parent household until I came here to Marquette High School. And the reason for that is parents at that time, in my parents' age group, were young. They were in their 40s. And there were no divorces. Catholics didn't get divorced. So I went through all of grade school and most of high school. There were no divorced parents. So you can see the dynamics of that. If you were from a single parent household, it was unusual.
And if you don't mind me asking, do you know how your father passed away?
Yes, he had heart disease since he probably was a child. When he was growing up, and he was born in 1908, kids had what was called rheumatic fever. And if you had rheumatic fever, you usually had damage to your heart. And he had rheumatic fever and had a series of heart attacks in his late 30s and early 40s and died when he was 44 from heart disease. And the other thing that I should add to that, people smoked all the time then. I mean, adults smoked all the time. And he was a very prolific smoker, so that did not help the situation. But in those days, there were no warnings about smoking cigarettes and heart disease or a stroke, or that it was bad for your health at all. As a matter of fact, they'd have advertisements on television around Christmas time with actors who pretended they were doctors and saying that they were giving cartons of cigarettes to their friends and family. I mean, my goodness.
Do you remember where your mother worked at, or like where she worked?
Sure, she worked at St. John's Cathedral High School as a teacher. That was a Catholic coeducational high school. If you know where the cathedral is downtown, where the Archbishop says Mass and so on, St. John's Cathedral, there was a high school on that campus, and that's where she taught.
Oh, do you remember Gertie the Duck growing up?
Well, sure, everybody knew Gertie the Duck. Right on the bridge over the Milwaukee River. Gertie, I think, was on the bridge on the Wisconsin Avenue Bridge. Sure. And those days, bridge tenders occupied small, like, guard houses at each of the bridges. And when the bridges opened, you know, in the non-winter season, they actually manually opened the bridges. Now they have it all computerized and they operate all the bridges from one office. But in those days, including the bridge that Gertie was on, there was an attendant who opened and closed the bridge.
Were you at the ceremony where they moved Gertie from like the bridge to her new home?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't.
So, moving on to high school, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, were you in any extracurriculars at Marquette High?
Yes, most of the extracurriculars at that time were associated with athletics. So I played on the freshman football team, freshman and sophomore basketball team, and I was on the varsity track team sophomore, junior, and senior year. That was pretty much my extracurricular activities. I belonged to the Sodality here. I don't know if that exists, but that was a Catholic organization. And I think that was pretty much what my extracurriculars were.
Was the Sodality like a service type group?
Yeah, yes it was.
Did you guys have follies at Marquette High when you were here?
Pardon?
Did you have like the senior follies?
No, it started in 1964, and I graduated in 1963. I just read that in a Marquette publication.
So in the pre-interview, you also said that the track team won in 62 and 63.
Yes. Yeah.
How did you feel about winning?
Oh, it was great. It was the pinnacle of, my time at Marquette High School. It was great that we won, and there were parties associated with it and so on. And if you go into the gym today, the Humphrey Gym, I think they still have the dates of the state champions under various sports, and you'll see 1962 and 1963 on the track listing.
Was there any moments in those state championships where like it was going down to the wire, or you did something where it was like quite memorial?
Well, junior year we won the state track meet pretty handedly, and senior year, how can I say this diplomatically? We beat Pius by 1 point, and it came down to either Ralph Wade from Kenosha or John McNally from Marquette clearing 12 feet in the pole vault. Ralph unfortunately did not, John did, and that was the 1 point that caused the victory.
Are there any like special teachers that you remember to this day from Marquette High?
Oh, sure. My favorite of all time was a guy named Donald Driscoll. He was a scholastic here when I was here, and after he became a priest, I still had contact with him, but he was at Creighton in Omaha, Nebraska. Wonderful guy. He was an English teacher here. Another guy named Dan Kenny, who was a Jesuit priest, was very popular here. Frank Kopinski, who was the football coach and the track coach here at Marquette High School, I was close to. All three of those guys have unfortunately died. Frank died about 2 years ago. He was 90. But I still kept in contact with Frank over all these years. He was an interesting guy. But of those people who were here when I was here, I think those were my three favorites.
What made them so special to you?
Well, Driscoll was just a wonderful guy, nice guy. Kenny was very, very funny. And if you were on one of Kopinski's athletic teams, he was very rough, really tough. He came from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and he brought that rough side with him when he came here. He had been a football star at Marquette University and taught history and coached here for many, many years. Anybody in my age group knew Frank Kapinski.
Oh yeah, what was the neighborhood around MUHS like? Like today, it's mostly African Americans. Was at the time that you went to high school, was it?
It was a residential neighborhood. It was the Merrill Park neighborhood, and it was well kept. I believe that all the buildings, whether they were single family or duplexes, were owner occupied, and they were nicely kept and so on. And I had friends who grew up in this neighborhood. They went to St. Rose Grade School, which is just east of here on 32nd in Michigan. Maybe it's 30th in Michigan. At any rate, it was a nice neighborhood. It was a very hard-working Irish neighborhood.
And what were the demographics like while you were here?
When I was here, I think that almost the entire neighborhood was made up of Caucasian families. I can't think of any Hispanic or African American or Asian families that I knew that lived here. And I knew a lot of people in the neighborhood, not necessarily because of Marquette High School, but because of my family's ties.
When did you start seeing like segregation coming into the city? Or like did you start
Segregation or integration?
Segregation, like
Oh, it was very deeply segregated when I was growing up. I know that I went to Florida senior year, and I was appalled we drove through the southern states, and you know, there were an African American couldn't go into a restaurant. They had different lavatories, which were inferior to the lavatories used by the whites. It was deeply segregated, and Milwaukee, unfortunately, has for many years has had a reputation of being very segregated. I think one of the things that even drove segregation even further is years and years ago, Milwaukee was going to build a freeway called the Park West Freeway. And it was going to go from 6th Street and Highland Avenue northwest all the way up to the northwest side of the city. They cut a big swath through that community for the building of that freeway. Really ruined the neighborhood, to say the least. And they never built the freeway. So I think that the politicians in this community in the early 60s didn't have the minority factions of the city at heart. It just didn't. If you go to maybe 16th and Fond du Lac, 24th and North Avenue, you'll see the angle of this swath of property where they knocked down all the houses, all the businesses, to build the freeway that's never been built.
So are you familiar with the term magnet schools?
No.
So they're essentially schools that attract certain people. So what I'm trying to get at is, while you were here and you played against people like on the other teams, like could you tell that this was like a mostly segregated school, or this was like a mostly like African American school?
Well, you know, all of the private schools at that time had very few minority students. As I said, my mother taught at St. John's Cathedral, and I can only think of 2 or 3 children there who were African American. As a matter of fact, I can name one of them, and it's been 70 years. Mesmer had a friend of mine who I went to college with, African American. I think he was the only one in the school. Francis Jordan, I don't believe, had any minority students. Marquette High School in my class had 4. Pius had very few. Yeah, there just were very, very few minority students at any of these private schools.
And as a student here at Marquette, what type of student were you? Were you like a more like professional, like academic student, or were you like hearing about like playing pranks or doing stuff like that?
I was more of a screw-off than a good student. Used to make my mother go crazy. Sometimes she'd unfortunately come home from parent-teacher conferences and cry because of the report they got about John. And at the same time, my brother was at the top of his class. He got A's in everything. So there was quite a difference between us. But I would say I was more of a screw-off than a student.
I heard that Marquette was a different time back then, like they were more physically punishing than they are.
Oh, yes.
Have you ever gotten physically punished?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I remember one time Terry Brewitt, a classmate of mine, and I locked another classmate in a locker after school, and we were just going to leave him there. And we walked to the end of the hallway, and Father Boyle, who was the prefect of discipline, was standing there. He carried a sawed-off golf club. And Brewitt and I saw him right away, and Brewitt went to one side of the hallway, and I went to the other because we knew he couldn't get both of us. So he took the stick and he put it out in front of Brewitt, and he grabbed me. And he said, "What are you guys doing here?" And we all said, "Oh, nothing, Father, nothing, Father." And as soon as that came out of our mouths, you could hear the student pounding on the inside of the locker, "Let me out, somebody help me." So he couldn't get both of us. He grabbed Brewitt. He let go of me and he grabbed Brewitt. And I booked. I wasn't staying around for him to open the locker. I'm not that stupid. And he whacked Brewitt around pretty good with that golf club.
Did he get suspended or like?
No, And then it was too bad because he took the kid out of the locker and he whacked him too for being so stupid to let McNally and Brewitt lock him in the locker.
Do you remember like any other type of stories like that where you?
Oh, there's a million of them. Actually, there are a million of them. There were people who had Volkswagens, and where the Hankey Center entrance is, that wasn't there. It was an alley, very narrow alley. And Volkswagens, I mean, you get 8 guys, you can carry a Volkswagen. I mean, you don't pick it all off the ground, you pick up the front of it and you pull it. And in those days, they were standard transmission, so the transmission wasn't locked like it is today with an automatic transmission. And it was, if you owned a Volkswagen Beetle and came to school here, your Volkswagen Beetle will end up at the end of that alley in a position you couldn't get it out. You couldn't turn it around. See, you could drag it in there, but you couldn't drive it in there. So that was one of the things that happened here. I remember one of the things that Tom Boyer and I did that it's very childish, but I thought it was terribly funny. We, at Easter time, would dye raw eggs. We wouldn't cook the eggs. And we'd come to eat lunch, and Boyer would have one of these eggs, and he'd say, anybody want an Easter egg? Of course everybody wants an Easter egg. And of course, when you broke it, went all over the place.
As you were becoming a senior, did you have any clear idea where you wanted to go or what you wanted to do?
I really didn't. I had a cousin who went to St. Norbert College, and he and I were friends and close to one another. He's 2 years older than I am. So I decided, I'll go to St. Norbert College. And oddly enough, Dennis Malloy, Andy Stockhausen, Jim Cavallo, Kevin O'Neill, and Tim Larkin, all of in my class, also went to St. Norbert's. So we all went. small school in the Green Bay area. It was fun. I assume there's still kids here who go on to St. Norbert's. Yeah.
Well, what was your class's senior prank?
You know, we really didn't have many senior pranks. The thing that we would do, though, is leave. You know, we'd all, 15 to 30 of us would get together and we'd all leave and we'd go and drink beer in Kevin O'Neill's basement because Kevin's parents both worked. Aha. And they sent seniors around to get the lists. The teacher would take attendance and pin it outside the door. There was a hook, you just hooked it on there. Well, they were foolish enough to have seniors take those lists to the office. Well, of course, we changed them. So if Cavallo, O'Neill, and Larkin had booked after the second last class, and their names were on the sheet, by the time that sheet left the door and got down to the office, they were no longer on the sheet.
How would you connect to girls or like women outside of this school? Was there like a sister school at the time?
Oh yeah, most of the people went out with girls from Holy Angels High School, which is a girls' school on 12th and Kilbourne. Divine Savior, which is the same place on 100th North Capitol Drive. And there were two girls' schools on the south side, St. Mary's Academy on Lake Drive near the seminary, and Mercy, which was girls' school on like 31st and Mitchell. But most of the kids went with girls from the girls' schools. Some went with girls from Pius or Mesmer, but that was it. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Did the schools, or did Marquette try to enforce like the two schools to like, or like the sister schools to come to like Marquette?
Well, I think they did. They used to have dances, you know, not date dances, but just dances on weekends, and they used to invite the girls from Holy Angels, Divine Savior, St. Mary's, and Mercy primarily. And I think they kind of wanted the Marquette High School boys to associate with those girls.
In your prank stories that you just previously told us, you mentioned one friend. Were you guys like best friends, or?
Tom Boyer?
Yes.
Yes, I was the best man in his wedding, and we see each other all the time.
Besides getting into pranks here at Marquette or stuffing kids in lockers, what else did you and Tom do?
On Friday night, there was a place in Muskego, Wisconsin, which there were no freeways in those days. It was a long ways away. And they had a dance hall there, and they had teenage bands that played out there. And the fee to get in was 50 cents, and we went every Friday night religiously, junior and senior year. And of course, we'd take 8 people in a car out there. And I can still remember the bands by name that played there. There were quite a few rock and roll bands here at the high school. Tom Olivas and the Chevrons, Rick Iraqi and the Del Reys, Art Herrera and the Fabulous Pharaohs. They all had kids who went to, in their band who went to Marquette High School.
Yeah, so how was your experience in the military when you joined?
How was my what?
How was your experience in the military?
It was interesting. I'm going to use that term, interesting. You really realize how lousy it is when your country's at war. When I left Fort Campbell, there were about 200 kids in our group. 139 of them were eligible to go to Vietnam. There are there were all kinds of rules and regulations why you weren't eligible, but 139 were eligible to go, 137 went. So it was a tragic time in this country's history. Nobody, the young people didn't want to be at war, couldn't understand why we were at war, and people were being shuttled off to Vietnam right and left.
Do you remember like any efforts people made to like try to avoid going?
Oh, sure. People used to do things to themselves, sometimes take blood pressure pills, sometimes stay up all night. And see, blood pressure was a big thing. If you had high blood pressure, they usually marked you 4F. So they did a lot of things with their blood pressures to try to flunk the examination. It worked for some. I think it did work for some. But I don't know. After I was a freshman in law school, we all lost our student deferment, so it was kind of a far-gone conclusion. You were going to go one way or the other, either in the regular Army or the Reserves or the National Guard or something.
Do you recall anybody doing anything like sort of extreme to get out of going to war?
Extreme. Yes, I knew a boy who had large feet. Probably wore a size 12 shoe. And for months before he took his physical, he wore shoes that were too small. And when he went to the Army induction physical, his toes were all gnarled in position, and he beat it. I think they're called hammer toes.
Do you recall some of the things that the military would make you do that was just like completely completely extreme?
Oh, yes. Everything was completely extreme. If you didn't finish your meal rapidly, they just took your tray, which had deep compartments on it, and throw it. You know, you had to go through a set of bars before you entered the mess hall, was the term of it. And one of the guys in my group couldn't do it. So every day he would eat his lunch, dinner, breakfast in the parking lot next to the mess hall, kneeling down with his hands behind his back, and ate his food like a dog. Oh yeah, this is crazy. Oh sure. The drill sergeants were cruel to some of the kids, you know. And it was too bad because they'd always pick out the kids who could least defend themselves and picked on them. And if you tried to butt in and help, you were in real trouble. You know. I had a guy in our group who wouldn't come out in the street. We used to go into the street in formation about 3 o'clock in the morning. And we did that because we were trying to beat the heat. You know, you'd get 5 hours of training in before it got real hot at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. And this guy came out and he sat on the front porch of the barracks, and the drill sergeant yells, "Get out here, get out here, get out here." And he says, "Nah, you treat me like a dog, I'm going to act like a dog." And so they sent him away, sent all of us away to the training, and he just sat there. And what happened is the drill sergeant told him to go into the barracks and wait. He went in one door and out the other. He went to the bus station and got a bus to his hometown, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And of course, when the bus arrived at Chattanooga, the MPs were waiting for him. However, he wasn't as dumb as you would think. There was also a bus ticket purchased to Los Angeles that same day. He bought the one to Chattanooga and threw it in the waste paper basket, took the bus, transferred to Nashville, and went to LA and was never seen afterwards.
As a lieutenant there, were you like, what are the specific type of like drills that you remember doing that you struggled with throughout boot camp?
I was overweight. So I had trouble in what was called, I wasn't a lieutenant, I was just a peon. You had to like alligator crawl, and I was terrible at that. And one time I was so bad at it that the drill sergeants took the sandbags that lined the little crawl pit and buried me in the sandbags. So I remember that quite vividly.
Do you remember any other things where the drill sergeants will do like extreme things to you specifically?
Not to me, but they did them to other kids. We had a drill sergeant who was just a racist ass. There's no doubt about it. And he went out of his way to pick on the African American kids. Way out of his way.
Do you know what he did to them specifically?
Oh yeah, first of all, he talked to them in the most racial terms that you can possibly imagine. And he would always give them the lousy jobs. I'll give you an example. At the end of every 2 weeks, you had to clean out what is called the grease trap, where they put the grease from cooking all the meals into this sink basin. It goes into a trap. It's a horrifying job. It smells terrible. The African American kids always got that job.
So how was life like at St. Norbert College?
Oh, I loved St. Norbert's. It was great. It was different than it is today. The campus was very small, and it didn't have the beautiful buildings that it has today, and the swimming pool and the field house and all that sort of stuff. But it was fun. It was great. We had a wonderful time. It was small enough that you knew everybody. You know, if you were a sophomore, your friends may have been seniors, or if you were a freshman, they may have been juniors. I mean, it was really a mix of nice people. At the end of the month, my wife and I are going up to Elkhart Lake to spend the day with 4 of them that I went to school with at St. Norbert's. So I still keep in contact with them.
Were there any like fraternities or sororities at St. Norbert?
Yeah, there were fraternities and sororities, and a lot of the kids belonged to them. I did. I belonged to one, and we had a lot of fun, you know, as college kids do. College is a great place. I don't know why the hell I ever left.
How'd you find time to like split your social life and then like your work life studying at St. Norbert?
Well, when I went to college, the demands weren't the same. I think the academic demands are much greater today than they were 55 years ago. You could kind of coast, and I did coast. I coasted until I was, I think, a second semester junior. Then I figured I had to get myself in gear in order to get into law school. So if you looked at my report cards from the start of freshman year to the middle of junior year, they weren't very good. But I picked it up the last 3 semesters and did well enough on the test to get in.
What are some stories that you have about you and your fraternity, if you have any, just at time in college?
Well, we did. I mean, there was a lot of fun, and we did a lot of things. In those days, you had to live in the dormitory. But of course, we all got together and rented an apartment off the campus that we used as a fun house. And that was primarily our social life, the home away from home. And you weren't supposed to have a car there, but many of the kids had cars, stashed them in garages around De Pere, Wisconsin. Farmers were great about putting a car in the barn for you.
And as a student, were you like the same troublemaker as you were here at Marquette?
No, I think that I got in line up there. I toned it down.
Were you, at the time that you were in college, were you set on being a lawyer? Have you ever thought about switching majors?
I was pretty much set on it. My family is a long line of lawyers. None of us could pass a science test, so what are you going to do? But I think if you take my wife's family, my family, and our extended families, my son who graduated from law school about 5 or 6 years ago was the 45th person in that group. So we've had, I think, 45 lawyers in my family and extended family.
You mentioned that you ran track at St. Norbert also. Were they as good
Yeah.
as they were at Marquette? I mean, they had you, so I imagine they were a pretty good team.
Well, I don't know about that, but they were Division II, and that allowed you nice competition. I couldn't have played, and neither could the other kids in Division I, like the University of Wisconsin or Michigan State. This was on a line with Oshkosh, Whitewater, St. Thomas, Hillsdale, Michigan, Northern Michigan, those schools. Those were in our conference. It was great, a lot of fun. St. Norbert's has always had an athletic team in almost every sport. You know, they have hockey and track and football and basketball, baseball. I think they field teams in 16 different sports. So it was a lot of activity there.
Do you remember winning any awards or championships as an athlete?
At St. Norbert's?
Yes.
Yes, I did. I won some college letters. You know, these, people who participated and played a lot got, a letter jacket, that sort of thing. And I won the Michigan Tech relays 2 years, and I was third in the state in what do they call in those days? It's the conference with the state universities other than Wisconsin. It's Whitewater, Eau Claire, La Crosse, and so on. So as a freshman, I was third in the conference meet, and some other things.
You said that you had a son that also became a lawyer. Did he follow in your footsteps of Marquette High, St. Norbert, or did he go?
No, he's a 3-M'er. He went to Marquette High School, Marquette University, and Marquette Law School.
Did he? How was Marquette different at the time that your son went to Marquette High compared to when you went?
Well, I think that the academic fabric of the student body is a lot better. And I think that the courses are more advanced. Maybe that's just the technology of today. But he was a very good student, much better student than his father was.
Did you have any influence on why he was academically better? Or?
No, I think he takes after his mother, who was a very good student. And we have, Jack has 5 older sisters, and they were very good students also. So my wife, 5 girls, and Jack all were much better students than I was.
You mentioned that you were a truck driver for a soda company?
Yes.
Yeah. How was the job as a truck driver? Was it? Did you
I loved it. I loved it. We delivered soda. We had a route, and you'd go out with probably 330 cases of soda, and they were pre-sold, and we'd deliver them and sometimes put them on the shelf, depending upon what the directions were. But we delivered to grocery chains. Kohl's was a big grocery chain here in Milwaukee. In Racine, we delivered to Piggly Wiggly, which I think still is the grocery chain in Racine. And we also delivered to all the ma-and-pa taverns. They'd take 5 cases of mixers for their bar drinks, and It was just a great job. In those days, I could make my law school tuition in 5 weeks. So it was really nice.
As you mentioned earlier about the guy getting angry and throwing soda or a case of soda and tearing
Yeah.
you up, do you remember any other moments as a truck driver that you remember?
Oh yeah, I remember I was on a truck one time and we were delivering soda to a place on the south side of Milwaukee, a large grocery store. It probably was a Kohl's. And the guy I was with went into the back door where the meat market was in the back of the store and said, which door on the platform do we stack the soda up? And the guy showed him which door. So we stacked 60 cases of soda up on the platform. And when we went to come in the door, it was the wrong door. This guy went off the rails and he took 28-ounce bottles of soda and threw them at all the butchers. He had 2 of them pinned down underneath the building. It was crazy. Had to call the police and he got dragged off. Yeah, this is kind of a wild job to say the least. And there were fights at the plant. You know, guys would get into fights over silly things, stupid things. But yeah, it was an interesting job. You learned a lot about life.
Did you ever get into any fights?
No.
No?
Nope. Mm-mm.
Is there, or what was the reason that you had to stop driving like the truck?
I graduated from law school and went to work for the district attorney's office of Milwaukee County.
So in the 1960s, there were a lot of events like the Cold War and then the assassination of JFK. How was the community of just like Milwaukee in general? How was Milwaukee at that time? Like there was a lot of like unrest at that time. How was Milwaukee affected?
Milwaukee probably had less unrest than other places in the country, but there were a lot of demonstrations against the war in Vietnam in probably in 1968, 69, and 70. And in 1970, 4 students at Kent State University were shot. And at least one of them died. They were shot by the National Guard at Kent State. And that was really the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. And the greatest amount of protesting came at that time. However, a year before that, the summer of 1969, 4 guys at the University of Wisconsin blew up the mathematics building with nitrogen fertilizer, and one of the teachers was working at night and was killed, Professor Fischette. And of the 4 guys, 3 of them were eventually arrested. They all fled. And one is still at large, never been found. David Sylvan Fine, Dwight, and Carlton Armstrong were arrested and sent to prison. Leo Burt is still on the loose. But those were big events in the protests for against the Vietnam War. Huge.
So we know that freeways were built because of like the civil unrest. Do you know like, or how did that affect like your methods of transportation? How did it make your life? How did it just affect your life? Like
the building of the freeways?
Yeah, and like the use of
Well, it was kind of interesting. I was a junior in high school and they started the first freeway. It went from downtown Milwaukee to 68th Street. So when I was in high school, that was the only freeway. So, you know, as I grew older, the freeways became more part of our lives. You know, they had a freeway then that went north-south out to the suburbs and so on. But when I was a junior in high school, that was the only freeway. It only went to 68th Street.
And do you remember the Boston Braves moving into Milwaukee?
Oh, sure. I was in the third grade, and I went to the second game that they played here. And I remember the game very vividly. In the ninth inning, a Brave, well, they were the Milwaukee Braves then, named Sid Gordon, hit a home run to win the game. It was a big deal. It was probably like April 20th, 1953.
And do you remember like how the dynamic was for every single game like that you've attended?
Well, it was kind of interesting. People thought that the games were kind of an elegant thing to do, and men wore sport coats and ties to the game, and most men at that time wore hats. To the game they wore straw hats, if you know what a straw hat is, and women dressed up to go to the game. They wore dresses and they looked nice and the kids looked nice, but the town just loved the Braves, just loved them. And it was the biggest thing that had ever happened here. When the Braves would go away for a series, out of town, there would be thousands of people who would go out to Mitchell Field to greet their plane when they came back. I mean, it was just a customary thing that people did.
Okay. How were you, or like the city in general, how did they feel when the Milwaukee Braves were bought out by the Chicago businessmen and then moved over to Atlanta?
Couldn't believe it. See, we didn't realize, we thought that the business of professional sports and baseball was attendance. And Milwaukee set all the attendance records at that time. We didn't realize that the real money was television and radio. And in those days, Atlanta was the only place that had a team in the South when the Braves went. They made more money without anybody in the stadium than they did here, because it was the radio and the television. Florida did not have a team. Texas did not have a team. The other states down there that have teams now, there were no teams in the South. I think the furthest southern city that had a professional baseball team was Cincinnati, Ohio. That was the furthest south that the major leagues went. So Atlanta had the entire southern part of the country to themselves. And these guys made a lot of money when they took the Milwaukee Braves and went to Atlanta. It wasn't the first Milwaukee team that Atlanta had snatched. Years ago, the Milwaukee Hawks of the NBA was our basketball team. Oddly enough, they're the Atlanta Hawks now. Very few people remember that. It was a long time ago.
And was there like any change in emotion when the Seattle Pilots moved to Milwaukee as a new team for the city?
Yeah, we were kind of spoiled with the Braves, because when the Seattle Pilots came, we were happy to get another professional team, but they didn't have any stars. And when the Braves were here, they had Hall of Fame people. They had Eddie Matthews and Henry Aaron and Warren Spahn, Red Shandings. We were spoiled. So the Seattle Pilots, even though we were very happy to have a team, were kind of a letdown. The first year they were here, they only won 39 games. And with the Milwaukee Braves, we were used to winning 90 games.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they never had a losing season here in Milwaukee.
I don't think they did.
Did you know Father Groppi or Lloyd Barbie?
Yes, I knew both.
Did you know them like on a personal level?
I knew Lloyd on a personal level. Father Groppi I just knew because a friend of mine represented him as a lawyer. So I knew him from that. But Lloyd Barbie was a fixture here in the Milwaukee area. Everybody knew Lloyd Barbie. You know, I wasn't like a close personal friend of his, but we were on speaking terms. We knew each other by name and so on.
What type of personality did he have? Or like, how was he?
Lloyd was kind of, I wouldn't say happy-go-lucky, but he was very friendly and outgoing and so on. Groppi was very serious. He was hell-bent on open housing, and he did a great job, and he took so much flack for trying to help the minority interests of this city. I'll tell you a story. They decided to bring open housing over to the south side of Milwaukee. And they marched across the 16th Street Viaduct. A lot of people, not only African Americans, but a lot of white people in the crowd too. Father led them across, and to show you what kind of a city this was, or might still be, there were some thugs on the other side with a casket on what is now Cesar Chavez Drive and Greenfield with Father Groppi's name on it. So, I mean, this was a dangerous time for these people, especially James Groppi.
Did you ever participate in any of like the marches? Like I think it was the March on Milwaukee. Did you ever participate in that, or just any of like the protests?
No, but I didn't participate in them, but when I worked for the district attorney's office, we attended all of them with the hopes of keeping it peaceful, but sometimes that didn't work.
And you mentioned that you were an attorney for Lloyd Barbie. Just like in general, as being a lawyer, were there any like clients that like any client stories or any client cases that like just like shocked you or just like moved you?
No, I on today's level, things were rather peaceful. When I worked in the district attorney's office, there were 46 murders in Milwaukee County. Last year, there were more than 200 in the city of Milwaukee. So you can see that there's a lot more violence today. What happened after I left the district attorney's office is drugs became very prevalent. Cocaine, heroin, so on. There was heroin addiction when I worked in the district attorney's office, but it wasn't of great consequence. But once the cocaine dealers got involved, things changed.
How did you see like segregation in the city affect like? How do you see drugs affect like those areas that were like completely segregated, like the north side? How did you see drugs affect that area compared to like other areas in Milwaukee?
Well, if you look at the city of Milwaukee public schools, they're probably still segregated. But I remember attending athletic events at public high schools that were primarily African American, and the kids were nice, they were respectful, they didn't get in trouble, they did their work, they tried to go on to school or some sort of trade. Now the kids don't behave very well in public schools. You know that.
So at the time in the 1960s, there was a hippie era, right?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever participate in that? Or
Oh, sure. Everybody thought they were a hippie.
do you have any stories of like just like
Well,
hanging out or just
yeah. I have one story that's kind of amusing, I think. I have a friend who went to Colby College. It's a small liberal arts college out east. And he graduated a year ahead of me. I really didn't know him then. I got to know him afterwards. And he and his hippie girlfriend and his hippie roommate drove across the country when they graduated and went to Northern California, Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, so on. And they didn't know what to do, and they were sitting around one night, and the two of them thought, why don't we take something that people can get for free, put it in a bottle, and sell it for $1.79. And they sold their company a couple of years ago. You've probably drank bottled water. If you ever drank Crystal Geyser, have you ever seen that label? Well, they ended up with bottling water. They were one of the first to do it, and they sold more than 1 billion bottles of water a year. And he's still married to the hippie girlfriend. She is 78 and still has a long braid. When I last saw her, I bumped into her in Colorado a number of years ago, and she was still wearing Birkenstocks. Do you know what those are? The sandals? Yeah. So, kind of a funny hippie story.
Were there any like bands that like hippies listened to specifically that like were popular at the time?
Well, yeah, I think the popular one, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Arlo Guthrie, were three of the real popular ones.
Did you ever get to see any?
Mamas and the Papas, number 4.
Oh, did you ever get to see any of them live, like at Summerfest when it?
Yes, the first Summerfest I went to, Three Dog Night was the headliner. So that was a big hippie band from that era, Three Dog Night.
Do you remember what was like the atmosphere like when Summerfest debuted and it was like opening day?
Well, it was on an area a bit a bit north of where it is today, and they just had bleachers and a stage. It was a muddy field because, you know, it'd be some inclement weather. There was no asphalt. And like at Blood, Sweat, and Tears, most of the attendees were smoking marijuana and drinking beer that they sold for 50 cents a glass. So you could get a lot of beer for $5.
Are there any like specific concerts that you remember that were just like outrageous or just like special to you?
Well, they used to have concerts at Alpine Valley when it was first built in the 70s, and those were outrageous, just crazy. They had seating for about, I think they had seating for 5,000 people, and they used to get 25,000 to come to the concerts. They'd be on the lawn, and you know, the kids would go crazy. So I guess it was that time in the early 70s where people started going to concerts more frequently than they did in the 60s.
Do you remember going to any games in the MECCA Arena?
In the what?
In the MECCA Arena?
Oh, sure. Marquette played there, and the Bucks played there, and the old Milwaukee Hawks played there. As a matter of fact, I remember going to see the Hawks play in the Milwaukee Auditorium. That's the Miller or the High Life Theater. It's immediately west of the Panther Arena. That, when I was very young, the Milwaukee Arena, the Panther Arena, didn't exist. So I've gone through the Panther Arena, not the Panther Arena, the Auditorium, the MECCA Center, the Bradley Center, and now the Fiserv Forum.
What was the dynamic like at the MECCA? Like I heard you were able to smoke, but you were just able to do anything at the MECCA. Like
oh, you could do anything. Yeah, people smoked all the time. When at halftime, everybody go out in the hallway, and a lot of people smoked. There'd be a haze of smoke in the hallway.
Do you remember any specific games that you've attended at the MECCA?
Yes. Of course, those were Al McGuire teams. And I remember them beating Wisconsin several times, which was a big thrill for us. And I remember them beating Minnesota there. And they had a 27-0 run in 1971. and they won every game at the arena. And I mean, Al McGuire was the most important thing in sports in this community, and the players were great. The last of which was probably Doc Rivers, who played there when I used to attend the games all the time. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot nicer. You seat about 11,000 people, and you're closer to the court. And the seats that you sit in are very nice and comfortable. The ones in the Bradley Center, if you were of any size, either in height or in weight, you couldn't fit in the seats once you got up to the 400s.
What was Milwaukee like the year of like the winning season of the Milwaukee Bucks, like with Lou Alcindor?
Oh, on fire. I mean, this was big stuff. And Marquette had a wonderful team. I think the Bucks won it in '71, and Marquette had an undefeated season until the third round of the NCAA that year. And the number one Division II team in the country was Eau Claire. So Milwaukee had Marquette, that was number one for a long period of time that season in Division I, Eau Claire in Division II, and the Bucks won the NBA championship. So everybody was all in on basketball.
How was the dynamic like when Lou Alcindor and Oscar Robertson played for the Bucks?
Oh, it was just great. We were disappointed. Oscar came here after, I think, 11 or 12 years with Cincinnati. But he and Alcindor hooked up right away as a great combination and won that championship for Milwaukee. Alcindor didn't ingratiate himself to Milwaukee. He was quite standoffish, didn't grant interviews, didn't attend events outside of the actual basketball game. But Robertson did. Robertson was more of a local hero. I mean, we certainly admired Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but I think people felt that Oscar was a lot warmer and fuzzier, if you will.
Was there any disappointment when Kareem shifted over and switched teams to LA?
I don't know if disappointment. We were sorry to see him go, but we got an entire team for him, and he didn't want to stay. When somebody doesn't want to stay, wish them well, get what you can for them, out the door you go. I think the most disappointing thing from that era was the fact that we lost the championship to the Boston Celtics in 1974, and the seventh game was played in Milwaukee, and we lost. I think that was real disappointment. I think that was more disappointing than Kareem heading west.
Now, shifting over to the 80s, you told us in the pre-interview that you knew Laurie Bambanek on
Yes.
a personal level.
Yeah.
What were like the type of conversations, or how was like your relationship like?
Well, they really all had to do with legal conversations about her predicament. She was very nice, very well spoken. She just didn't fit the part of a convicted murderer. I don't know if anybody does, but she didn't. I can tell you that. But yeah, she was a nice person to deal with.
Outside of like conversations with her for legal reasons, did you participate in any of the protests for like Run Bambi Run?
No. I think when you're practicing law, you ought to be the lawyer, not the cheerleader, or not the friend, not the participant. So the guys in the law firm that I worked with, we never entered into those things. It just didn't work well.
How were those movements? Like, how strong were they? Like, as like just protests? Were they violent? Were they?
No, they weren't. They were large in number, but there was no violence. There was violence only in the protests of the war in Vietnam. As you know, they blew up the mathematics building, and there were fights on the street with the protesters and the people who lined the streets watching them.
In the 1980s, there was a lot of deindustrialization. How did that affect people close to you, like with the job loss and just stuff like that? Because I know Alice Chalmers like just shut down like in the 1980s.
Yeah. During Carter's presidency, 76 to 80, there was a lot of fall off, and shortly after that, industry left or shut down in Milwaukee. You know, Laddish Corporation and Bucyrus Erie are still here, but Alice Chalmers is gone. Press Steel Tank, Rex Chain Belt, Civia Steel, those places don't exist any longer. I don't think Evinrude Motors exists any longer. There were others, I just can't think of them offhand, but there was Milwaukee took a substantial hit financially because all of those jobs were family supportive jobs. If you had a job on the line at Harnischfager or one of those places, that you made enough money to support your family. So when the jobs were lost, those jobs were good jobs. It wasn't like losing a minimum wage type job. Those were good jobs and supported families. So Milwaukee really was hit when manufacturing changed here.
Were there like specific communities that like either close to you or just like that you knew of that were affected by that deindustrialization?
Well, I knew a lot of people who lived on the south side of Milwaukee, and they were affected. They were a lot of them worked at, you know, manufacturing plants on the south side of Milwaukee, and they were cut out of a job. You know, many of them took early retirement, but that doesn't work very well.
You also mentioned you had one conversation with Jeffery Dahmer.
Yeah.
Do you know what that conversation went like? Was it?
Well, I can't go into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, as you said right now, you weren't going to disclose anything, but how was like the tension was, or like with him? Like, did you feel uncomfortable? Was it like a normal conversation?
It was a normal conversation, and he was very quiet. There was nothing unusual about it.
And as talking with Laurie Bambanek and like talking about a lot of legal things in her case, are there any bits of information that you know that the public doesn't?
No.
No.
I don't think so.
Moving into more present day stuff, where exactly were you on 9/11? Like, what's your story about
Well, I was at work, and we had rooms with television sets in it. And one of the guys came in and said, some plane hit one of the towers, one of the Twin Towers. And what went through my mind is probably somebody in a single engine Cessna or something hit the tower. So I went in, and a bunch of people were watching the television. And as we were watching, we realized, boy, it must have been a much bigger plane because there's smoke billowing out and a lot of problems and so on. And while we were standing there talking, you saw the next airliner come around on a big sweeping curve, go right into the other building. So I was at work, and I saw the second hit live on TV.
What was your immediate reaction to that?
Couldn't believe it. I knew that, you know, obviously there were terrorists, and the government of the United States was under attack. This was no small matter. And then they right away scrambled jets to try to find the other two jets, the one that had ended up crash landing in a field in Pennsylvania, and the other one that went into the lower level of the Pentagon.
Well, what was the state of the city like after the crash? And how
Oh,
long did it last?
everybody was just frozen because they really shut down the country. They ordered all the airliners to land, and we were just in a tizzy. Couldn't believe how many people were killed.
More into like the most like the couple past years. How did the pandemic change your life change after COVID hit and became a national outbreak?
Pardon?
Or how did your lifestyle how did your lifestyle change when COVID hit?
It was kind of miserable. I had semi-retired at that point, so I didn't have a lot to do. And then when COVID hit at the same time, I couldn't really do anything. It was prior to the vaccine. So you didn't feel right about going out to, well, the restaurants were closed, movie theaters were closed. You pretty much stayed home. I stayed home and annoyed my wife. That's what I hear. But yeah, it was a lousy 2 years.
Did you pick up any hobbies throughout those 2 years?
No,
No.
I really didn't. I should have, but I didn't. I have a cottage out in Oconomowoc, and I spent most of my time there.
On the topic of your wife, how did you guys meet?
I was hoping that wouldn't come up. This is unusual. My wife, my brother was married to my wife's older sister. I'm married to my brother's wife's younger sister. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters. Now, this is still legal in Kentucky and 2 places in West Virginia. I'm kidding.
Oh.
But whenever I tell anybody that, 2 brothers married 2 sisters, they all go, oh, God. But that's how it was, yeah.
Do you remember your story of your proposal, where you did it?
Yes, I did it at her home after dinner one night, and she thought it was one of the weakest proposals she had ever heard of, but she accepted anyhow.
What did you do in specific during the proposal? Was it just right after dinner and you just got on one knee?
It was her birthday, and I was present for her birthday, a diamond ring. Yeah, she didn't think I was very romantic about the whole thing, and I guess looking back at it, she was right.
And how was the wedding? Where did it take place?
It took place at St. Sebastian's Catholic Church on 55th and Washington Boulevard, and in those days you had to get married in the morning. There are no afternoon weddings or so on. So the reception was really lunch rather than dinner, because the whole church thing was over by 11 o'clock, and it was at Alioto's, which is a restaurant on approximately Highway 100 in Burleigh.
You mentioned that you have a car collection. How did this?
I've always had an interest in cars. And when I was a child, of course, I wasn't in a position to have any. So I used to go around to the dealerships. My mother would take me when I was in the 5th or 6th grade, when the new cars would come out, so I could look at them. And I just was enthralled with them. So when I got myself into a position, I bought. Now, I didn't have them all at the same time, obviously, but I would buy cars and keep them and enjoy them and sell them and buy another one. I bet I've owned 75 cars. So.
Do you have any cars in specific that you loved or that you
Yes.
sell compared to others?
Yes, my favorite car of all time was a black Bentley 4-door sedan. It was called a Brooklands, and it was a great car. It had a big engine in it, and it was very long. It was just a great car. It I had it in 1993. Favorite car I've ever had.
Do you still have it today?
No, I didn't. I traded it in for another car.
Okay. And to present day, do you still have a car collection?
It's dwindled to very little. I have 5 cars.
Dick McNally, Meredith McNally, or 5 others.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so lastly for this interview, is there anything that we didn't mention that you would want to share with just people on YouTube?
No, I don't think so. Nothing, extemporaneously. No, I can't think of anything.
Right.
I think the thing that really shaped my life and put it in the right direction was attending school here. Really, when you look back at it as you are older, you look back at it a lot differently than you did when you were here. And the contacts that you made here and the friends that you made here and the things that you learned here, other than academics, serve you well in life and are very important. I really believe that.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
for coming on here.
cool.
Yeah.
All right.